The water that Rouse County Council supplies to over 100,000 people across our community comes from different catchment areas in the region. These include near pristine areas of subtropical rainforest, such as Rocky Creek Dam, and multiple-use catchments that contain areas of agriculture. Eventually, the water that runs off our drinking water catchment area will be consumed by people. Contaminants including pathogens, nutrients, sediments and chemicals can enter waterways as a result of agricultural activities and can affect river health and drinking water quality. The source of these contaminants can be controlled by local landholders, resulting in a direct effect on our community's drinking water supply.
Rouse County Council, working together with all of our catchment landholders, working to make the big scrub the best it possibly can be, means that we're going to have a healthy catchment and produce a fantastic, sustainable water supply.
I mean, property environment plans are really a subset of farm planning. So there's lots of different sorts of farm plans. Whole farm plans are quite a common generic product, and they look at the farm business, the commercial side of the farm, and a bit of the environmental side. But primarily they're more about the business model and the produce you're producing and how best to handle that in the long term. But a property environment plan just puts a bit more detail on that environmental management aspect of your property.
Probably one of the hard things when I talk to people about the need to keep cattle out of the small gullies and streams, because they really are where the water quality story starts, is the fact that on your property you might have a lot of gullies, a lot of these small streams. Can you fence them all? Is that realistic? If it's not, which ones do I fence first? These are all sensible questions. So probably the best way to have yourself work through that is to produce what we call a property environment plan, where you look at all the individual small gullies and streams on your property. You work out which ones are getting the most pressure, maybe one near a holding paddock near a house where the cattle hang around longer, and you progressively start to fence those off first. This creates a great buffer strip. The property environment plan that you can produce is very practical. What should come out at the end of it is the high priority areas, maybe some areas you'll never get to, but at least you've made a start and you start your work on your river restoration in a practical, logical way.
There are frameworks you can use to develop your own plan, available online, or you can engage a professional to help you to put yours together.
Hi, well today we're going to be talking about rivers. I guess most people think they know what a river is, but I'm hoping today that by the end of it you'll realise you actually knew nothing about rivers at all. So the first question is, well, what is a river and what's it all about? I think rivers really, you've got to get your head around two things. It's really just water and gravity. Interestingly enough, that a cubic metre of water, which isn't a very big compartment if you like, that actually weighs a tonne. So when that cubic metre of water starts moving, it's amazing the work it can do. So we all know the sort of work that rivers do. They erode hillsides, they transport sediment, and they deposit sediment. And what we'll be looking at today is some of the elements of how all that takes place and how that interacts with the vegetation and how the two things, the physical form of a river and the vegetation, go to make up the whole ecological package.
George.
I can't believe it's going to be warm too.
Hi team, glad we're all here today. Picked a beautiful morning for it. Today we're going to be running a river management field day, and you might be asking, why have we come to this small little gully to start that field day? I think it's pretty important that we are here because the whole management of rivers starts in these small gullies. First thing I want to talk about on this river presentation today is to kind of bust a myth. If you want to look after rivers, the place you've got to start is in your paddock. So why in the paddock? Well, it's quite simple. You'd imagine when you've got really heavy rain, the water is pouring down in that paddock. If that paddock is hard and there's very little grass and stuff on it, then straight away what you're getting is the water rushes off, it carries a lot of the soil with it, and where does it go? It goes into that little gully. Now I'm going to tell you that that little gully is as important as a major river system. All those little gullies, which we describe as first order streams, they're just the small gullies up near the ridge line. If you mapped out the entire length of all those first order streams, all those little gullies, there's far more of those than there is of what you traditionally think of when you think of a river, which is the big channel and all the rest of it. Consequently, if you're interested in improving water quality, the key thing is to manage all those little first order streams, all those little gullies first. And if you want to manage the little gullies, you've got to manage the paddocks, because all the water off the paddocks, or most of the water off the paddocks on your property, drains straight into those little gullies, those small streams. So take home message there is, look after your paddocks, keep some ground cover on them, have buffer strips between your paddock and those first order streams, and straight away you're starting to get towards having good water quality in your creeks. Okay, the first thing to do when you're looking at your rivers is you need to classify them. I know that sounds a bit boring. Us humans love to classify things, and rivers are no different. But the advantage of classifying rivers is, straight away, it acknowledges that they're all slightly different. The management that might work on your neighbour's place possibly won't work on your place if it's a different type of river. So let's accept that we classify rivers and it gives us a lot of information. Okay, let's get into river classification. The particular method that I use was developed by Macquarie University quite some years ago. It's called river styles. It's based upon that science of fluvial geomorphology that I was talking about, where you look at the shapes that the river, when it transports sediment, makes. Basically what the river styles framework does, through a number of techniques, you classify what sort of river you've got. And the procedure gives you like an identikit for your river. And you can use this identikit. It describes how many channels you should have on your river. It describes what features you should have within the channel. It describes what sort of features you should be able to see out on the floodplain. And it enables you to basically walk down to your river, tick off on your identikit list for your river, am I seeing these features? If you are seeing most or all of those features, then chances are your river's in a pretty good physical condition. But if you go down there and you're seeing a whole bunch of features that aren't there, or weird features that are there that shouldn't be there, straight away alarm bells just start to ring and go, hang on, something's wrong with this river. What's happening here? Okay, now we've got to get our heads around some science. Fluvial geomorphology. What is that? It's the science behind the physical shapes you see in a river. It's broken, that word, that phrase is broken up into three things. Fluvial, water; geo, landscape; morphology, shape. So we are going to start looking or classifying rivers based upon the fundamental shapes and the patterns of shapes that we can see along the river landscape.
Electric, it wasn't an issue, it just caught all the water. Right. I mean, caught all the grass.
Okay, we've moved down here to the main river. What I want to talk about down here is the riverbank vegetation and the interaction that that has with the river and how the river behaves and changes over time. So the first and most important thing to get your head around is, if you've got a riverbank that's really well vegetated, and then you cut all the trees and shrubs down, basically what will happen is, during a flood, the water will flow along the face of that riverbank at about twice the speed. So, well, you might say twice the speed, that's no big deal. But because of the mad physics and equations associated with the movement of water, if water speeds up by a factor of 2, the amount of energy that it has goes up by a factor of 4. So it's no great surprise that riverbanks, where the vegetation has been removed, are far more erosion prone than riverbanks that are really well vegetated.
Thanks, Rick. I guess what comes up for me is, especially with new landholders, when they've got their bit of land and they're super keen, but they don't know where to start or which to prioritise. You know, should they fence off that top gully you were talking about earlier? Should they get down here and stabilise the bank, get rid of the weeds, focus on shading the water? Where to start? How to get going?
Yeah, so look, on that issue of where do we start and what should the priorities be, it's a recurring issue, that one. I think possibly a good example would be if you've looked at your creek, you've observed it over a couple of floods, you've worked out where a bank might be starting to chew away. When you've looked at that, if your feeling is that by fencing out that area, by restricting the stock out that area, you'll get some natural regeneration happening, then that might be a really good starting point. And traditionally, there's been funding assistance around to help with some of these things. Speaking to your local land care group about what's available at any given time is a really good starting point in terms of engaging with perhaps some funding support to do these sort of works.
Rick, I was wondering if I could ask a question. We've put up a fence along the riparian zone to keep the cattle out already, but now is there anything else that we have to do in the riparian zone, or can we just leave it at that, or do we have to weed constantly now?
Yeah, look, it's a tricky business, and this whole issue of fencing off creeks, for some people it's instant alarm bells and no way, never. And I can actually understand that because it has been done badly in the past. First point to make is everyone's situation and everyone's creek bank's different. So it drives me mad when I hear people say you've got to go 10 metres back from the creek or 20 metres back from the creek and put up a fence. Nonsense, you've got to work it out at your own pace. One key thing to think about, for example, is if you do fence the creek out, you're going to get a lot of different stuff growing in there. How are you going to manage that in the long term? So often you have to think the problem backwards. And so you think about how I'm going to manage that for a year, 5 years or 10 years. And if the answer to that is occasionally I'm going to put some cattle in there and crash graze it, then maybe you need to put the fence back a bit further and accept it becomes a linear paddock. Now that's not an ideal situation because we don't want cattle in the creek, but if it means it's really easy to maintain that area and it helps your maintenance of that area, then by all means do it. So it's a case-by-case situation. And don't be afraid of giving up a little bit more land and accepting that it's a linear paddock that you just manage a bit differently.
Okay, so you want to fence off your river. What if the fence needs to go in the flood zone? Isn't it just going to wash away?
Okay, look, that's a great question because it may seem like craziness on a stick to build a fence in an area that you know floods, but sometimes you have to. Now, a bit later on, I can hand out a brochure that I've written that looks closely at the different designs of flood-resistant fencing. It can make an enormous difference as to whether your fence survives the flood or not, depending on how you construct it. So in that brochure, I go through the positioning of fences, the need to put little sacrificial sections in so bits can fall out if they are going to be hit by floodwaters for sure, and how to build a very loose and open framework to allow flood debris to flow through the fence rather than get racked up on the fence, which is the usual cause of fences failing during floods.
I've got a lot of river frontage on my place and a lot of erosion. What should I do about it?
Yeah, look, most people that come to field days, that's the number one question. I've got bank erosion, what can I do about it? Tricky thing with it is there are several things that can cause bank erosion, and funnily enough, one of them wasn't recognised for many years. Often you actually get erosion in the bed of the river. This is where the bed of the river is actually lowering because of some disturbance that's taken place in the bed. That could be an excavator going in the bed to dig a hole or pulling logs out of the bed of the creek. But the point is, if the bed is lowering, it's kind of removing the foundations of the riverbank. And if that bed lowering is still ongoing, it's pointless doing anything to try and fix your riverbank until you've sorted out the bed erosion. So that's the first point. Second point is when you look at bank erosion, there's actually 3 or 4 factors that can be causing bank erosion. So it's a really good idea to identify what's causing it in the first place. And the 2 big groups, if you like, are obviously water just flowing against a bank, undercutting the bank and the bank falling in. And the second one is, particularly when you've got high banks, it can actually be water soaking through the bank face, causing the whole thing to slip and move. In both cases, riparian vegetation, native plants and trees on the bank face will help. And in the worst cases, you might have to build some structures to stabilise the situation first before you put those plants in. Another common trap when people are doing revegetation works along their riverbanks is they don't appreciate that there's multiple energy zones along a river. So during a flood, there are some areas where you get very strong flood waters, so there's a lot of energy, and other areas where things are a bit more gentle. The fascinating thing is that over the years, the plants have evolved to specialise in different energy zones. So you might think you're doing the right thing, you get some local native trees that are riverbank trees, but you take the ones that have evolved to live in the low energy zones and you plant them in the high energy zones. They get going, then a nice flood comes along and it's bye-bye plants, they've all gone. So important to get your head around the different energy zones in your river system and also make sure that you match your plants to the energy zone.
Rick, how do I know what plants to plant in the high energy zones?
The best plants to put in these areas? I suppose, assuming they're a high energy area, if you look down the river here today, you can see beautiful native water gums growing right on the edge of the bank and hanging out. They're quite amazing in terms of their ability to withstand flood flows and hold the bank together. So looking at the high energy sections of your creek, seeing what native plants are growing there, don't overlook the little grassy looking things down in amongst the rocks, because often they've got beautiful fibrous roots. So a combination of those trees that have evolved the high energy areas and the little sedges and things like lamandras or mat rush that have those lovely fibrous roots, they're great things to plant on the bank face and at the toe of the bank if you want to protect it. Yeah, so if you want more information about what plants to put in those erosion areas or on your riverbanks generally, your local landcare groups are usually a good starting point. They've been around a lot of years usually, and they have an entire library of information that you just have to tap into basically.
So there is funding available for property owners who want to do work on their properties, but it is getting less and less. So the most successful ones we're finding are groups of property owners, 4 or 5 ideally, who have something in common. So they either live on the same creek or they're in a wildlife corridor, or they have threatened species, and they put in a collaborative grant application for funding. And your local landcare group is available to help you with those grant applications.